I bet you've heard the phrase, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I think by now we've all come to the conclusion that words do hurt and they do hold power. And if you didn't believe it, I hope by the end of this chapter, not only will you know that that's true, but that you'll kind of begin to understand why. So, welcome to our chapter on language. I want to jump in and talk a little bit about the nature of language. So, what is comprised and how does it kind of affect our communication overall? So, let's look at a few components. Symbolic. Language is really often symbolic. We see a picture in our head when we use certain words. So, it is directly connected to symbols for us. You've heard this before, we'll say it again. Meanings are in people, not words. So when someone says that word triggers me and you say that's ridiculous, well, just because it doesn't trigger you doesn't mean it doesn't trigger them. We have to understand that how they decoded that word or what it represents to them enhances the meaning for them. We have language that is governed by rules. We say things like, that's a bad word, and this is a good word. My kids say that's $1 million word, or that's a $2 word, depending on how complicated it is. Who made this up? Is there a dictionary somewhere that says, here are all the bad words, here are all the good words? No, it's part of our culture, and we've developed these social constructs that sort of govern, and these rules are sometimes explicit in our homes, but sometimes they're implicit in other places. Now, here's some of the rules we live by. Phonologically, that's how you pronounce it. So if I were to say hyperbole, you might look at me odd, and then I would say, oh, I mean hyperbole, which is just how you say it. Syntactic, how you put words in order changes their meaning. And again, another rule is semantic. The meanings that words have to us or the dictionary, you'll see words in this chapter like connotative and denotative, and then pragmatic. They're just practical rules of how we use words to do different things, and things like we should say please or thank you. So we kind of get into etiquettes. Here's what you need to know. Oftentimes, our words develop misunderstandings. And so in this chapter, I hope you'll begin to see that they have the power to avoid misunderstandings, but also to repair misunderstandings. And so let's look at how powerful language really is. What is in a name, right? We hear this in Romeo and Juliet, but when your parents name you, they might have told you the story behind where your name came from. Maybe you were named after the great Michael Jordan or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that name makes you feel something. I was named after my mom, and that feels really powerful, and I named my youngest daughter after my mom. My youngest daughter is named Lucy after my grandma, who went to the university, Eastern Illinois University, in 1940. I was so proud of her, and she loved me so well, and I couldn't wait on her 90th birthday to tell her that she was going to have a namesake. Now, my daughter feels so proud that she's named after her great-grandma who went to college and was brave when other women were not going to university. Accents, dialects add or enhance the language that we use all the time. You're going to see something called powerless and powerful speech. Powerless when we talk, or if a student comes in and is confident and uses language like, I'm going to tell you how this is going to go down and I feel great about it. And they'll use language that is assertive. And so powerless is where we say, I think maybe we use these qualifiers. Now, there's a great TED Talk by Adam Grant called The Power of Powerless Communication, and how we can use what sounds bad, powerless, to actually connect to our audience. People sometimes don't like someone to come in and pretend they know everything and they figured it out. They can honestly use powerless communication in negotiations to say, maybe we could try this, or I'm not sure, but have we thought that maybe we could take a different approach? That can be very effective. You'll also see a term, affiliative language, that is so important for you to be able to understand and know. Now, is your language powerful or powerless? It's really important that you start to listen to yourself and say, do I sound powerful? Or Do I sound powerless? And when you do this, again, it's based on context. So when we talk about competent communicators, they know when it's important to use powerful, assertive language. Maybe you're giving your team a pep talk before they go out onto the field, and you don't want to say, oh, maybe, I thought we could, maybe, when, I don't know, right? Powerless communication can also be really useful. And so those qualifiers, maybe if we think about this, or I hate to say this, but I may not be able to do this. In certain contexts, powerless communication is not effective. In certain contexts, powerful communication is not effective. But they can both be effective depending on the situation, and that's what makes great communicators great, or have what we call a high communication EQ. Misunderstandings happen all the time. So I want to go over just a couple of those words. Equivocal words that can mean a few different things. So be careful when you're talking to someone, maybe if they're from a different culture. Relative meaning, it can be really tricky because you can say, well, relatively, but you want to make sure that you're clear in your communication. We all kind of know what slang and jargon is. Jargon is usually a term we use for technical things. So if you're an engineer and you're saying, oh, we need to work on the PLC or the schematic, I'm married to an electrical engineer, so those are terms I hear. Only if you're in engineering and you've spent some time in automation systems do you know what that means. So if you're at NASA, or if you're in education and you say, man, we need to get this kid's EIP together, I would be saying, as a parent, I'm sorry, what is an EIP? When I first came to the college, people threw around all kinds of acronyms. You can work on your KPI and your IPP, and we're using, just call the doc or the DOC, and I would go, I don't know who that is. So I would keep a running tally of all the acronyms, and I would find someone safe and go, hey, can you decode all this jargon for me? Now, slang is usually a little more informal, and you all know what slang is, and I have teenagers who tell me what certain words mean, like no cap, and if you're watching this 10 years after I recorded, that probably means something different now, or if you had asked me if I spilled the tea, I would say yes, and we need to get a paper towel, but that means something different today. So slang is usually informal, and euphemisms are words that imply something, and so we use a word to imply something and talk about an issue that maybe is a little uncomfortable or impolite. So slang and jargon, we have disruptive language. So slang and jargon can be helpful, but it can also create some disconnection. Disruptive language is a little bit different. So disruptive language is where we start to throw around facts versus opinions. And in this chapter, I really want you to look at and to think about, when do I throw out facts versus when do I throw out opinions, right? So a fact might be, this is the most popular show on television because this statistic or the data analysis said this many million people watched this week. So numerically, it's the most watched show on television. But you could just say, this is my favorite show, it's the best one ever. That's an opinion that may not be based in fact. To be really careful, because when we throw out our opinions and we present them as facts, it can disrupt, lead to disconnection. Fact versus inferences, where we imply something. So being really careful that we're not inferring something about a person or about potentially a politician, or not being direct with our communication. We want to make sure we don't also present emotions as facts. Just because you had a terrible experience, we don't translate our emotions as truth. I know someone whose garbage disposal tore up something very important to her. And so she's decided she doesn't trust garbage disposals, not only for her, but now she tells people they can't be trusted. We take sometimes our own emotions, we present them as facts, and while our experiential knowledge base can be valid, it cannot carry the weight of truth. And so we want to make sure that we have facts or research to back it up. Real simple one that I'm sure you all know is that insulting language can be disruptive, and all of these can lead to disconnection. All right, we look at things that sort of overlap with language and how it's affected. And so years ago, there was an author, researcher named Deborah Tannen who came up with a theory called genderlect that basically says men communicate differently than women. In fact, they wrote books like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And they wrote almost like we're two different planets trying to communicate. So I want to look at some of the trends or patterns that really still hold up, even though some of that has become fluid over time. There are biological factors involved. We find that on the aggregate, it's a statistical term for the whole, oftentimes there are parts of a male that communicate differently. So maybe we call it rapport. They sometimes like status versus women tend to want to communicate in a way that creates rapport, R-A-P-P-O-R-T, or connection. So sometimes I'll say on the whole, men like to communicate shoulder to shoulder. So we see that in an offensive line with football, but we see it with maybe males playing a video game together. They feel bonded. Oftentimes in parenting communication research, we see that if you're trying to connect with a son, you would maybe go for a road trip, and they're more willing to open up when there's not eye contact. It's not true with femaleness. They do lots of interesting studies about putting toddler boys in a room and toddler girls in a room, and the toddler boys tend to be maybe aggressive. They end up in a dog pile, or they grunt. They don't make a lot of eye contact. The toddler girls are jabbering away. So that can affect that. How they develop friendships really matters. And so being careful that we don't interpret how we approach friendship and talk to each other in maybe a female to female friendship that we would in a male to male. Obviously, this plays out in dating, what we consider to be healthy and not healthy, and affective, where it's connective language or it creates bonds. All of these are sort of categorized by language. And finally, instrumental language. You're going to see these words, and I want you to, again, this is kind of a 10,000 foot view. I want you to get into this chapter and look and see how this plays out. And are you using your language effectively? And are you understanding the language that's being used around you? I think it's so important that we learn to do this really well. So you'll see little quizzes in here about how am I using language? Am I doing it effectively? I also want you to think in your own life how social media is played out in this. And you'll see an article about men talking, women talking. So when we talk about communication, we mention talking, but also in this realm of social media, we talk about posting. Who's posting a lot of information? And can that be categorized by men or women? So I want you to look at an article I'm going to post for an assignment this week to say really who's talking the most and how that's played out, not just at home, but at work, and where you live, hang out, play. I want you to begin to pay attention to language that is being used around you, and really how it's used to effectively connect you with others. I want you to start to take inventory of your own language. How is it perceived? Are you really choosing words that would not be disruptive, but would be connective, not disconnected? It's so important that we really begin to look at that. Am I using language in my workspaces that are maybe task focused, or am I implying things? So you're going to see lots of different terms, and you're going to think, oh, I already kind of know this, or oh, that makes sense. Take a minute, watch some of the videos in this module. I think you'll find it really helpful. And I think that even though we already know that sticks and stones can break our bones, and also words too, but I hope we'll slow down, we'll think before we speak, and we'll start to really use the words that we use to effectively connect with the people that are around us.